I'm very happy to see such a good turnout for this meeting. This is a celebration of election forecasting. The American Political Science Association has been a leader in this kind of work in political science. Election forecasting is a new subfield, relatively new subfield in political science. APSA and especially PS has spearheaded publication in this area. Its most recent publication came out, the April issue of PS is got 16 articles on forecasting. That's the cover of it. Well, actually, that's a PS cover. The PS, that's what PS looks like. They're copies of this recent issue. I think all of you have a copy of the April issue, and you're welcome to take that with you. It's got 16 papers. And one of the goals, there were two goals there. One was to make these papers readable. So, and that if you're interested in elections, and if you at least started college, you ought to be able to read these things and understand them. The other one is that we have a mix of papers. It's not, just your boring old political science professor. Well, they're in there too, like me. But then there are other people who do other kinds of forecasting. There's people who do prediction markets. Charlie Cook is in there with the Cook report. Stu Rothenberg with his report. There are commentators. In other words, there are commentators, there are media people, pollsters, and so it's quite a good mix. And we recommend it. Some people are already using it for teaching. So I will now pass. That's my minute and a half. Now Mary, we're on a very tight schedule. So now Mary's going to say a little bit more about what forecasting is.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mary Stegmaier. I'm at the University of Missouri. I wanted to point out first, you all have a folder that was on your chair, or hopefully you picked one up outside if you don't have a chair. There's some people who are standing. So in your folder, you will find copies of the PS articles that each of us wrote. So if you're interested in the presentations, we encourage you to take a look at those articles. Also, you will find the very first sheet, the flyer. On the back of that flyer is some really basic information about election forecasting. I'm going to talk about some of that now. And that includes a graph that I will describe and walk you through. So if you do have that, it looks like this on one side, and the back of it is a one-page sheet of information about election forecasting. The goal of election forecasting, as you might expect, is to accurately predict the election result as far in advance of the election as possible. So we might use public opinion polls the day before the election. That can be interesting, but it's not that far in advance. And so in political science, what we do is use mathematical models to predict elections as far in advance as possible. So sometimes this is 6 months in advance of the election, sometimes it's 4 months in advance of the election. And as we do this, we use what we know about how voters behave, election theory, voting behavior theory, to create mathematical models. These models include things, depending on whose model you're looking at. They include public opinion polling data, sometimes economic data, as well as possibly presidential popularity, the results of primaries, etc. But the models are mathematical models that political scientists tend to focus on. So an example, a really basic example of this, is the figure that you see on the back of the flyer. This shows the relationship between the change in GNP over the first 2 quarters of election year, so from January to the end of June, and it plots this against the two-party vote share for the incumbent party for presidential elections. And I've charted this from 1948 to the 2002 election. So each one of these dots represents a particular election year. And you can see what the vote share was, as well as how this corresponds to the change in GNP over the first 2 quarters. The line that you see on here is a best fit line. This is a predictive line. So if we know what the change in GNP is, by, say, June or July of the 2016 election, we can then use this line to predict what the incumbent presidential party vote share will be, so what the vote share will be for the Democratic Party. As I said, this is a simplistic model. Most of the models that are used in political science are much more elaborate or include other factors as well that we know influence election results or that voters think about as they're making their voting decisions. So why is election forecasting important? What is the value of this? There are many different reasons that political scientists can give for why election forecasting is useful. I'll just mention two that I think are of great importance, especially for the audience that we have here. First, I think there's democratic value in election forecasting. It is a way that we can understand how voters are holding elected officials accountable. We can understand what factors voters are considering. And if we know this, then politicians would be wise to keep some of these factors in mind as they are making decisions over the course of their term. Election forecasting, as we've seen in recent years, also serves to engage the public. The public finds this interesting, and they get engaged and involved in the campaign in a way that if we didn't have public opinion polls and forecasts, they might not be quite so interested in following the events, the policies, and issues that are discussed over the campaign period. So to the extent that election forecasts are publicized in the media, we think that this is a useful tool or useful way to engage the public in politics. So I'm going to turn this over now to four of the authors who have written contributions in PS, and we are starting first with Matt.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you all for coming here. Thank you for APSA for putting together this panel. My article, which I want to briefly summarize in 5 minutes, which goes by very quickly, I found out, is essentially an effort to explain what happened in the 2012 presidential election, and a side benefit is I get to make fun of journalists and pundits, which predominantly is what I do in most of my classes at Middlebury College. Throughout the 2012 presidential campaign, political pundits were openly wondering why, if you looked at, for instance, aggregate polling on markspolster.com site, it appeared that Barack Obama was leading, and again, the aggregate polls, his opponent throughout the campaign, despite the fact that there was a relatively sluggish economy, which, according to most pundits, should have doomed the incumbent president, right? David Brooks openly wondered, why is this election even close? If you look at the fundamentals, the president should be getting crushed right now. The reality is, and I have a brief graph at the back of your folder that shows the aggregatepolster.com. Mark might talk about this. Obama led throughout the general election campaign and, of course, won a victory, right? How could this be? Pundits immediately said it must not be the economic fundamentals, but that voters were discounting the fundamentals in favor of other factors such as candidate likability, racial affinity, cultural identity politics. And moreover, and you saw this in a lot of the postmortems, it was apparent that Obama had simply run a better campaign. He had chosen better tactics. He had a better ground game. And his advertising was really effective at painting Romney as a plutocrat who was out of touch with the concerns of the middle-class Americans. That's conventional wisdom. Be honest. Raise your hand if you believe that narrative. Come on. How many of you buy that narrative? I bet everyone in this room buys that narrative, right? Which is all the more reason for me to tell you why it's wrong, right? And think about the underlying basis here of what you're saying. You're basically buying into the argument that voters, based on this conventional media narrative, are dupes. They're easily swayed by campaign ads, unexpected events, candidate gaffes, as opposed to couching their vote in terms of more fundamental things like, is the economy improving, or are we at war or peace, right? Fortunately for the reputation of my panel members here, and for the American voter, the evidence supporting this media narrative, I think, is remarkably thin. And as evidence, you can look at the forecast models. In the aggregate, and Drew might yell at me a little bit here, in the aggregate, those forecast models actually predicted that Obama victory. And most of those forecast models, the ones that Mary's alluding to, incorporate the economy as one of their explanatory factors. In fact, if you look at the second graph that I have here, you'll see that 8 of 13 forecast models predicted an Obama victory. And in the aggregate, all those forecast models suggested he would win slightly more than 50% of the two-party vote. He won slightly more than 52%. We can debate on whether that's a good outcome or not. Right? This is the graph, if you're looking for it, in the back of your folder there. All right. The other point I want to make here, my students often push back and say, what are you saying? Campaigns don't matter? It's all written in stone? No, campaigns matter. Lynn will probably pick up on this, right? But presidential candidates do not create campaign narratives out of whole cloth, right? They have to deal with the reality out there, and that reality includes whether the economy is doing well, whether we're at war and peace. And the key here in framing your campaign is, if you're an incumbent, to fasten on those elements of reality that are most favorable to you. And if you're the opponent, as Mitt Romney was, you try to shift that frame if you can, and Lynn will talk about this, I'm sure. If you can't, you got to fight it out on the same ground. My interpretation of 2012 is that Obama ran on the idea that he inherited a horrible economy. He was getting slightly better on his watch, give him more time. Romney decided to fight him on that and basically say it's not getting good fast enough. And in the end, slightly more people bought Obama's argument. But the point here is the election turned primarily on the economy. Exit polls show 74% of respondents cited the economy or the deficit as the major issues on which they voted on. Not race, not cultural values, not all the things that Double Down would have you believe, debates, for instance, right? And if you look at these alternative explanations, the evidence in support of Obama's superior ground game or the advertising blitz are remarkably thin. I don't have a lot of time to go into the details of this, but note that turnout is actually down in 2012, as was Obama's share of the vote. And indeed, in 5 of the 8 key battleground states, the drop-off in Obama's vote was greater than his decline in his overall national vote. So precisely where you thought he should be doing better because he focuses ground game, he's actually doing worse. Same thing about the impact of campaign ads. Summarizing a whole bunch of advertising studies here, campaign ads have a very short shelf life. Right? They last maybe 2 weeks, and people, we go back and ask them, did you remember that ad 2 weeks before? And they say no. Right? And when you have both sides pummeling the airwaves with ads, it's hard to say airwaves made the difference. And finally, the likability factor. We may not have thought that a presidential candidate who puts his dog on his rooftop is pretty likable, but the point here is likability doesn't seem to be a very influential factor on the vote. Mo Fiorina has looked at the past 13 presidential elections and found that the candidate with the net advantage in personal ratings won only 7 times. Right? So likability is not a huge issue here. Right? So, bottom line here, contrary to the pundits' post-mortem, the 2012 election turned on precisely the factors that drive most of these forecast models. Candidate strategy, including the media campaign, mattered, but primarily as a means for framing those economic fundamentals in ways that benefited their candidates, right? Bottom line, Obama won for the reasons that incumbents in previous years, when the economy is slightly getting better, have won. It's really hard to defeat somebody under those fundamental conditions. And we should be reassured about this. We should like the fact that voters in the collective base their decision on things that mean something, as opposed to debate gaffes or personality quirks or any of the other myriad factors that our journalist friends argue are explanations for election outcomes. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lynn Vavreck, and I'm a political science professor at UCLA. And I am going to talk about the importance of campaigns. If you hang around with people like us long enough, you'll hear a forecaster say that if you knew only one thing, like the growth rate in the first 6 months of the election year, you could predict which party was going to win the presidential election with amazing accuracy. And they'll say 75% of the time. And the graph that Mary mentioned shows that. What you won't hear forecasters say too much about is the importance of campaigns in fostering that outcome. We know an awful lot about how small changes in the state of the nation's economy affect predicted outcomes of presidential elections. We don't say very much about how small changes in campaigns, in the quality and the effort that candidates give, change our predictions of who will win. It's not because that topic is uninteresting, it's because the data to do that are quite hard to gather. We would have to know how much effort people were putting in and what they were talking about. It's been a topic that has attracted me for a long time, and so over the course of several years, I set out to do just that. I read every stump speech that presidential candidates gave. I read all the news articles that covered presidential campaigns, and I looked at all of the advertisements that candidates ran from 1952 until the last election. And as I was reading and watching all of these campaign things, I tracked the topics that candidates were talking about. I put all of that together and I looked for patterns. And what I wanted to see was, did candidates who were advantaged by the economy, who are predicted to win based on that line that Mary told you about, did they talk about the economy more than anything else in their campaigns? And did that talking about the economy and being advantaged by it actually help them? Were there people who were advantaged by the economy and didn't talk about it? And did those people lose? So that was my goal. And here's what you see if you look at those patterns. So over the last 16 presidential elections, that'll take us back to 1952, 12 candidates who were predicted to win based on the nation's economy went on to victory. That's the 75% that you'll hear forecasters talk about. 11 of those predicted winners talked about the economy more than anything else in their campaigns. So right away, we see that candidates seem to understand this. If they're advantaged by the economy, they talk about it. Of those 11 candidates who talked about the economy more than anything else, 10 of them went on to win their elections. So being advantaged by the economy and talking about it seems to lead to winning. That pattern looks pretty clear. But does a failure to stress the economy in campaign messages when candidates are advantaged by it lead to losing? So there are 5 candidates who, despite being advantaged by the economy, don't make it the focus of their campaigns. And the question is, what happens to them? Well, 3 of them lose. The 2 who win are incumbent presidents running for re-election, and that'll be Nixon in '72 and Clinton in '96. So being advantaged by the economy alone may not be enough. Candidates also need to remind voters of their role in fostering the good economy. And if they fail to do that, they are more likely to lose. But here's where it gets interesting. Is merely talking about the economy enough? And so we just heard the story about 2012 and Mitt Romney trying to suggest that Barack Obama had not done enough to bring about economic recovery. Okay, so is that a successful strategy? If talking about the economy is important for people who are predicted to win based on a forecast, is talking about the economy enough to change the landscape for those candidates who are predicted to lose? So of the 16 candidates predicted to lose based on a simple economic forecast, 5 of them talk about the economy more than anything else in their campaigns, despite the fact that the forecast says it'll advantage their opponent. And those 5 candidates were Hubert Humphrey, George McGovern, Bob Dole, John McCain, and Mitt Romney. Those 5 people have one thing in common. They all lost. Why do candidates who are predicted to lose based on the economy focus on the economy in their campaigns? Okay, it's not a crazy thing to do. It's not hard to understand why Mitt Romney does this in 2012. A quick look at public opinion about the state of the economy shows that people were sour on the economy. Most people thought that the economy was stagnant or had gotten worse over Obama's tenure, and indeed within the last year. Very few people thought it had improved. So how could that not be bad for an incumbent president? The answer here is counterintuitive and often hard for candidates and analysts to believe. But public opinion about the state of the economy is quite divorced from the actual economy. Okay, it is not that people can't figure out whether things are good or bad. They absolutely can. That's why the aggregate result looks the way it does. That's why that line that you see is sloping upward. People get it. They can do it. But during an election year in public opinion polls, something introduces a tremendous amount of noise into people's assessments of the economy. What is that thing? Partisanship and vote choice. And here's how it works. In 2012, Democrats thought the economy had gotten better on average, and Republicans mainly thought it had gotten worse. And over the course of 2012, if you initially were leaning toward Romney, as the months wore on, you thought the economy was getting worse. And if you were initially leaning toward Obama, as the campaign wore on, you thought the economy was getting better. It's the same economy. Okay, so people's perceptions of the objective economic conditions change depending on their partisanship and their vote choice. And that's what makes relying on public opinion about economic evaluations a dangerous strategy for candidates. It's hard not to get sucked into doing it. How can this not be good? But ultimately, Mitt Romney changed a lot of people's minds about the economy in 2012. They were just people who were already going to vote for him. Okay, so the economy is powerful, but partisanship is powerful too. And the data are quite clear. Evaluations of the economy correlate with aggregate outcomes at 0.46. Okay, evaluations of the economy correlate with the real economy, real economic change, 0.57. But remember that real economic growth, that condition relates to vote outcome at 0.75. Okay, so if you're a candidate, you're much better off looking at the objective condition than at people's opinions about the economy and thinking that that's going to be able to be the focus of your campaign or that you're going to be able to change people's minds. The certainty of our economic forecasts can be bolstered by knowing what kind of campaigns these candidates will run. I agree with the forecasters. We don't need to know who the candidates are. We can make these predictions in June of the election year without knowing who the nominees are going to be. But I want to know one more piece of information. I'd like to know what kind of campaigns they're going to run, what they're going to talk about. Knowing that Mitt Romney was going to focus his entire campaign around the economy in June of 2012 would have told me a lot about his chances for winning that election. He was going to put himself in that set with 4 other people, none of whom had ever won in the last 65 years. James Carville was probably right in 1992 when he hung the sign in Bill Clinton's war room, "It's the economy, stupid." But the part of that story that everyone forgets is that Carville was hanging the sign in Clinton's campaign war room to remind the candidate and his surrogates that when they talked to the media, when they talked to voters, the number one thing to be talking about was the economy. Carville is essentially telling all of us, it's the campaign, stupid.
Thanks, Lynn.
Sure.
All right, well, thanks to all of you for coming out today. It's great to see so many people here. To introduce myself, my name is Drew Linzer, and I am here because I did a lot of forecasting myself in 2012. So let me tell you a little bit about my background. I originally started my career as a survey researcher who switched into academia. I taught political science at Emory University for about 5 years, and in the political science department, I mostly did applied statistics. Within the last year or so, I've made the move back to, I guess, what you would consider the professional political world. But what I want to talk about for my little segment of time here is where we are, I guess, scientifically and technologically speaking with election forecasting and where we're going. And it's an area that I think is very exciting because there's a lot of progress being made very quickly at improving forecasts, both in their accuracy and in their lead time. So I personally have always been interested in why elections turn out the way they do. But from a, I guess, a technical standpoint, this was a problem that I really started thinking about seriously 2007, 2008, in the lead up to the presidential elections. And this eventually led up to spring 2012 when I set up a website called votomatic.org. I don't know if any of you have seen it. It's been well dormant since 2012 after the election ended, but it's still there and you can go check it out. And I did that to start publishing some of the state-by-state forecasts and the results of the models that I was fitting around the presidential election in 2012. So what the material on that website was based on was some of my research that showed that it was possible to build a statistical model that started out over the summer making forecasts state by state based on what we consider to be these fundamental factors, how the economy is doing, is the president popular, those sorts of things. These long-term baseline factors, but then update those forecasts pretty much on a day-to-day basis, state by state, based on all of these public opinion polls that are coming in and being collected, hopefully by people like Mark here. And we had to think about 1,700 of these state-level polls in '08. There was only about 1,200 of these in 2012. But that's a lot of expensive research that's provided free to people like me to do the things I do. So I really can't complain. And so what we can do is take all of these polls as they come in, update these forecasts, and get improved accuracy as we get closer and closer to Election Day. And it's in slight contrast to the way things were traditionally done up until that point, which is you collect all these fundamental factors over the summer of the presidential election year, and then you make your prediction, and then you sit around for 3 or 4 months and see if you were right. Okay, so my predictions turned out to be correct, which is why I'm here. If you want to read more about it, there was an article I published in the Journal of the American Statistical Association, so you can go find that. But really, this process that I'm describing about starting off with a long-term forecast and then updating it with more current information is really no different in principle than forecasting the weather. Say you're planning a party in the park, what you would do is you would check the weather 1 or 2 weeks ahead of time to get a rough sense of whether it's going to be hot or cold or having a thunderstorm or tornado, I guess depending on where you live. But then you wouldn't stop there. You would check again the day before your party is going to happen with more current information. So when we make these forecasts over the summer about elections or presidential elections, we expect them to have error. We expect them to be wrong. That's just inescapable. And there's lots of reasons for that. The main reason isn't because political scientists don't know what we're talking about. It's just because it's a really hard problem that has a lot of random fluctuations to it, and there's not a lot of historical data from which to extrapolate to the future with any really high degree of accuracy. So I think what's exciting about election forecasting right now is that we have this theoretical, this set of theoretical ideas that political science as a science has developed over the years. Thanks to a lot of work by people like Mike and his colleagues. And what we're seeing now is what I think of as a transition from political science to something more like political technology, where all of this information and knowledge that we've built up is being packaged and put together with new quantitative tools and statistical models to do things, I think, sort of in part like what I was doing, but that we couldn't do before. And that technology is moving ahead pretty rapidly. And it's not just theories about how voters behave. It's theories about how polls are conducted, how people respond to polls, the impact of campaigns, like what Lynn was saying, the earliness with which polls are representative of election outcomes, and how the predictive ability of that information compares to other information. So there's just a lot of scientific work that has gone in to making this technology now feasible. And so academics like to talk about what their theories are, but really there's serious technical challenges here. Measuring what's happening out there in the public, we're getting better at that. We're also getting better at extrapolating, coming up with models that extrapolate from these better measures to future outcomes. And really being honest about what the uncertainty is in those forecasts is really important. I think that it can sometimes go a little overboard, like when we get carried away with the probability of Obama winning ticking up from 70% to 70.1%. Did I say we go overboard? Maybe a little overboard there. But it is really important to I guess, couch all of these forecasts in the appropriate amount of uncertainty. All right, so why do we do this? It's really not just for entertainment, although as we've seen to many of us, it is entertaining. And it's also not to generate clicks on your new data journalism website, although appears to accomplish that goal as well. But really, all this new political data, all this new political model is shaping how politicians run for office. I'm sure this is stuff that you're seeing. I mean, this is really happening right now. And I think it's also going to be increasingly shaping what politicians do once they get to office. And as we, as forecasters, get better at this, we'll learn more about what politicians can actually do, as Mary was saying, to affect their chances of winning elections. And I'm also optimistic that this can and will lead to better representation. Now, I don't want to be too triumphant about this. I had some success with forecasting, but the reality is that there's still a long way to go. We're not even close to being able to accurately predict vast types and levels of elections. Basically we can do the presidential elections okay, and from there on down it gets a little dicey. And I really think we should be honest that this is contrary to the storylines about the victory of the nerds that came out after the 2012 election. The nerds had a nice moment, but there's a lot of work to do. Averaging polls the night before the election is going to be held is not really the point. It's kind of too late by then, so we need to do better than that. And again, Matt said I was gonna pick on him a little bit. I mean, these fundamental models contradict each other, and so if the majority of them were right in 2012, I think it was still 40% of them were wrong. And again, it's not because we don't know what we're doing, it's because we don't know which variables matter. And so really what I think forecasters nowadays should be saying is, if you think this variable, the economy, is what matters, then it would be reasonable to expect a certain outcome. If, on the other hand, you think this other variable, presidential popularity or incumbency, matters, then it would be reasonable to expect this other outcome to happen. That's a way to be a bit more honest about the limitations of what we know right now and point a way to do better. Where is this additional data that I was referring to going to come from? One way would just be to wait around for another 50 years until some more elections happen. I don't want to do that. So, the things that predict elections now might not even be the things that predict elections then. So we need more information. The polling, this new trend, really within, what would you say, the last 10 years, less, 5 years of public polling, has been an incredible windfall, but there's no guarantee that that's going to continue. And I think that we need to be creative about where this extra information is going to come from. Maybe it will be social media, prediction markets, we don't know, but it's an area for research. And the last thing I'll say is that I really see a positive feedback loop between this technology and political science as a science. And I really don't see it as being very much different than when, in scientific laboratories, when new technology comes in and lets biologists do more research, or chemists, or physicists, or whatever it is. When you give scientists better tools to do their work, they'll do better work. And so I really think that the scientific side, building the technology, is a great development, but that technology should come back and reap dividends to political science. I think we're really just more at the beginning than at the end of this effort to forecast elections. But I also think that we've pretty much proven that what I consider to be sophisticated quantitative research really does have value to contemporary politics.
Hello, my name is, and I'm going to do this so I don't go on and on without stopping. I'm Mark Blumenthal. I write I'm the senior polling editor at the Huffington Post. As my colleagues have told you, I started a website called pollster.com along with a political scientist, Charles Franklin, almost 8 years ago, and now cover polling. So I'm a little bit the odd person out on this panel in that I do have a political science degree, but it's an undergraduate degree. I'm not a PhD. I'm not a faculty member anywhere. And I was trained as a pollster, as a survey researcher, which means I was taught to think of my measurements, the measurements that we take as snapshots, as moments in time. And that includes the question, if the election were held today, for whom would you vote? Trained to think of that as something that's changeable and dynamic. And we've been talking a lot about forecasts, and a forecast is, by definition, different. It's supposed to be a prediction of what's going to happen in the future. So as Drew says, getting it right on election night is sort of beside the point when it comes to forecasts. The forecast is supposed to be steady and straight. And one of the things I've learned is we launched Pollster and watched how, yes, it drives a whole lot of clicks to a web page in September and October of even-numbered years, that audience that comes and makes our traffic surge doesn't really see the distinction between the snapshot and the forecast. They want to know who's going to win. They want to know, and it's a lot of you in this room, you want to know if your team is going to win. And so the distinction is sort of fuzzy. And as I've watched, the paper that I did for PS sort of traces the origins of this from the first sort of poll of polls that, what is his first name? Schneider at CNN did in the late 90s through Real Clear Politics and the sort of simple averages that they continue to do through what we did at Pollster, through 538, and to the clearly more algorithmic and theory-based work that Drew did. We're getting closer and closer and closer to formatting, or to forecasting. And what Drew did, you heard a lot about Nate Silver in 2012. For my money, the innovation that was most interesting was the work Drew did, which was to really, in effect, if you look at the lines, they were flat. He was taking that fundamental forecast, and because he picked a good one, and I'd bet on him to pick a good one again, the dislocations that we knew would occur around the conventions, when there are always bumps that tend to go up and recede, and also that we've learned now can happen around debates, which may be more about the failings of polling than about changes in people's preferences, those smoothed out. So if you looked at his forecast at any time, you had essentially the same forecast of the result. But the thing that I want to emphasize with the little bit of time I have is that I think that distinction between the snapshot and the forecast is important and worth preserving, because while that mass audience may not care, the one that wakes up and lights up our website for 5 or 6 weeks a year, the audience of journalists, of your bosses if you work on the Hill, of those of you who run campaigns, of those of you who that my poli-sci colleagues here think of as the party actors, the elites who sort of influence everyone else, you care also about the dynamic of what's changing in that campaign. Why are some campaigns succeeding and some losing? If we try to predict Senate races, which is a whole lot harder to do than predicting the presidential outcome based on the data we have. If you do a fundamental model now, as the Upshot at the New York Times is doing, as the Washington Post is doing, as I'm going to guess Drew may be doing before the year is out, and others may be doing. If you take the polling out of it right now and do a forecast, the back testing suggests that you're going to miss 4, 5, 6 Senate races a year. By the way, if you do that with polling right now, you're going to miss 4, 5, 6 races a year. They're not all that different. But the point is, those outliers, the ones that miss, those are interesting, because sometimes they're about a campaign dynamic. Sometimes they're about a candidate that does something well and you can trace their process. Sometimes they're about primaries happening and different candidates emerging, and there's a snapshot now in Kentucky and another in Georgia that may look very different. Kentucky just had its primary, Georgia just had its first primary, they're waiting on their runoff, but once those are settled and we take these measurements again, vote preferences may look different. Now this may be the nature of polling, but they'll change and we'll learn something. They'll matter in some cases, but not others. There are a lot of candidates, the most classic failing of polling is the notion that one candidate is very well known and one is poorly known. And so the one who's well known is going to tend to do better. In Virginia, Senator Warner has a challenger named Ed Gillespie, who may be well known in DC, but he has virtually zero name recognition in the rest of Virginia. I guarantee you, whatever the snapshot is right now, it's going to be closer when the race is over, because Gillespie will have more name ID. But I'm not going to, I can't predict where that'll end up. Now, 20 years ago, we might have said that we could almost predict that path, that the incumbent's number might stay level, but we've learned that as campaigns have changed, modern campaigns have figured out that a challenger who's not well known is an opportunity to blow up. And so you see all of that playing out. I've talked for about 5 minutes, so I think I will end it there. If there's interest, the 15-minute presentation that I've outlined, we can talk more about the Senate modeling and how they differ. They are not all created equal right now, the ones out in the public, and which gets to Drew's point about both how unsettled this, how this is not a solved problem, how there are very small differences in the way the models are constructed that are producing what you may perceive to be big differences, even though they're all basically saying that the contest for the Senate is too close to call as of today. But anyway, thank you for having me and for listening so patiently.
First, let's give a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you. This was tremendous. Okay, so yeah, I forgot to, I'm Mike Lewis-Beck, University of Iowa. I should have told you that at the beginning. I'm not on Facebook. So what we're going to do now, we've got some time for questions and answers from you. So I'll just monitor those, and I will repeat your question if, where's Jennifer? Do you want me to repeat the question, Jennifer? Okay, so that's just for the audio visual. So, yes, sir.
Much of what you've talked about so far is incumbent candidate versus challenger. I presume it carries over to incumbent party versus challenging party. And if it does that, then sort of getting to the last point, why wouldn't that present the same sort of chances at the congressional level? If there's an incumbent party that's being favored versus a challenger party, or doesn't? Does it carry over to congressional elections?
The question is about the role of the incumbency versus challenger party. Who'd like to take that question?
I'd say something about it.
Okay, so.
By the way, I probably should have introduced myself as well, since we're now getting to know each other. I'm Matt Dickinson from Middlebury College, and I write the Presidential Power blog post. So there's actually a debate among political scientists about the power of incumbency, and presidential forecast models, the notion of the incumbent party as opposed to the incumbent candidate tends to work a little bit better at lower information level campaigns like House campaigns, where incumbency is a far more powerful factor regardless of party, right? So you might have, so when we're trying, gets to the complexity Mark was talking about. When you're modeling congressional campaigns as opposed to presidential campaigns, there's a lot more uncertainty because candidates do matter. Incumbency matters. Incumbency is often associated not just with incumbent party, but with the individual incumbent himself. And that gets to part of the complexity that Drew's talking about. It's not just a question of, and Drew and I sort of go back and forth on this, of better methods, better data, but it's also choosing theoretically which variables you think are important. And incumbency is probably much more important at the House races than it is in the presidency race.
Yes, sir. You want to speak on that one?
I could throw in one.
Okay.
There are, how many of you have seen the model of the Senate that's in the New York Times, the one called Upshot? And the Washington Post has one too. And Nate Silver did one that said 60%. Anybody seen those stories? Well, some of you have seen these, some of you haven't. So the idea is, much like the thing that Drew described, there are models that are, most of them are combining, well, actually they're all different. The New York Times is combining polling and these fundamental factors. For the moment, the Washington Post monkey cage model is just looking at fundamental factors alone. And Nate Silver's model is, and I quote, done by hand, not strictly algorithmic. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but it does sort of include both. And they will, by the end of the summer, they will roll something out that'll look a lot like they're all going to look like each other. But there are differences in how they handle this. So right now the Times model is saying there's a 41% chance of a Republican take over the Senate, and the Post has those probabilities at 75. And there's a whole second conversation about how big a difference that really is, which I'll leave. But one other difference is the way they treat incumbents. So the Times model includes the approval rating of the incumbent where it's available as part of the sort of stew. And the post-monkey cage doesn't. And so there's a pretty big difference, about 30 percentage points in the probability of victory in that race. And so I don't know the answer. Neither does the field, right? How hard you pull on the lever for incumbency versus fundraising versus the polls versus the 5 or 6 other things I could measure. Those are things that these folks are working on, scientifically.
One thing on that, just what you'll see, like Mark already gave you a good example, polls, different sources give different predictions, and that's because the models are different. And you as political scientists have to do the hard work of asking that person or studying their articles to see what the models are. And if they're doing good journalism, they should let you know. So you should be able to read their papers and follow the links and see the model. Because if you can't see the model, then you don't really know. I mean, it's all hearsay. It's not enough to say handwork. If you really want to get to the bottom of why is this person predicting this and this person predicting that, you have to look at the models. Okay, this gentleman back here.
Hi, I'm Richard Skinner. I have a question about the election that haunts every forecaster's nightmares, and that was 2000, where most models predicted a fairly clear victory for Al Gore. He did win the popular vote, and pretty much everybody just follows the popular vote, maybe but certainly a margin that was a lot smaller than the models would have. And that question is enveloped in a larger one, which is about open seat presidential elections. Are they as forecastable as ones that involve an incumbent? And do you buy the time for change argument that what matters in part is how many terms has an incumbent party been in the White House? That a incumbent party after one term will get the benefit of the doubt, but after 2 or 3 terms, it's harder to go up to the White House. So we've got the specific 2000, the general, open seat, and time for change.
Okay, you got 3 questions. We'll take the first one and see how that one goes. The first question is about the 2000 forecast and how that fared. So who would like to speak to that?
I can.
Okay, Drew's going to.
Well, I'll try to briefly speak to each of those. Okay. I already said that it's not perfect. 2000 was a good example of that. I cite the 2000 failures as a reason why we need to keep working on this problem. Or so historical observations. And as a statistician, that's just a minuscule number. And what that means is that we can't tell very well. We can tell to some extent which models are bad, but there's a lot of models that look equally good. And so sometimes you get what you observed. Is it the case that I guess open seat presidential elections are harder to forecast than ones in which an incumbent is running? The answer is I don't know. But sorry, the
Time for change.
time for change. Yeah, I mean, so your question is, do I actually believe the time for a change argument? I believe it to the extent that the data shows evidence in support of it. And I've looked at all these, I've looked at the historical election results, I've looked at all these variables that people proposed for explaining elections, and it does seem empirically to be the case that that variable is very predictive of incumbent party candidates doing worse by about 3 to 4 percentage points than they would have otherwise. And but this is again based on very limited data, and even if it is the case that that variable is having that effect, maybe it has nothing to do with voters getting tired of the incumbent party. Maybe there's something else entirely going on, and we just don't know. So there is this tension. There's this tension. On one hand, you have the scientists trying to come up with theories to help us do forecasting better, and then you have the technical people trying to do the best we can with limited data to just make correct forecasts that are useful, even if there are maybe some mistakes in the underlying theories. So I don't know if that's a totally satisfactory answer, but I think it's an honest one.
Can I just say I just want to say quickly two things. The first is that my story on 2000 is, there's no doubt in my mind that if Al Gore had not distanced himself from Bill Clinton and the Clinton legacy in that campaign, he would not have lost the 2000 election. But that's actually not what I want to say. What I want to say, when Drew said, the forecasts were wrong, I just want to say that I don't actually think that, I don't agree with that, right? When you're talking about an election that's turning on 532 votes, any forecast of an election that close is going to, if the forecasts came close to predicting a tie, then they were essentially right. Okay, so that's a crazy close election. Anything could have made a difference in that election. And then the other thing, I just want to echo what Drew said at the end, that in terms of time for a change, the same pattern can be observationally equivalent with voters are tired, or that the incumbent himself cannot run again. And so there's this pattern there, and the question is, that's where the art comes into the science. What do you make of that pattern? And because we have a limited number of cases, and we don't get to observe things that we like to be able to observe to rule stuff out, we can't actually know what that statistical pattern is telling us. That's my take.
One thing on the time for a change, there is a lot of evidence from other countries. It's also called a Costa ruling. And what we see in democracies throughout the world, there's a cycle. And as incumbents get reelected, they tend to lose more and more votes until they're kicked out of office. The United States, if you look at elections, presidential elections in the United States, basically a party's in for 2 or 3 terms and is out. It's a rhythm. It's like a roller coaster. You see the same thing in Britain. You see the same thing in France. That's quite interesting for forecasters. Okay, let's see. Who's got another question? Well, there are lots of questions. The young lady from Middlebury. That's where my son went, so that's why I'm calling on her.
This is mostly for Dr. Vavreck. I was just wondering kind of to what degree a campaign's ability to get their message impacts the election, so ground game, all of that stuff.
Question about ground game.
I think first I should say that when I said that I had read all the campaign messaging, that was in presidential elections. And I think for these House and Senate elections, it is very different. The power of incumbency there is huge. But when you're talking about messaging, I think we're not talking about the ground game. So I really view those as 2 very different kinds of activities. One happens months, a year before the election, strategy, theme, message, and that kind of development. And then the other, the ground game, is a tactics. It's a tool. And so, yes, perhaps the people who are canvassing, the mailers, the phone calls, all of that is echoing some central message. But, if you believe the things that you're hearing from presidential campaigns more and more, those kinds of contacts are targeted to specific messages to specific groups of people. So the kind of messaging that I'm talking about and the power of the campaign message is a much more macro level kind of thing, advertising essentially.
Way back in the back. Yes?
Yes, thank you. I'm wondering if one of the panel can speak to the ethical effects, possible ethical effects of publishing, forecasting results and predictions. For example, there was kind of an overshot in 2000. People didn't think there was as much support for Al Gore, but more people have turned out to vote and therefore made it more of a certain victory for him.
Okay, very good question about the ethics of forecasting. Who would like to answer that?
I just want to say one thing quickly, which is I don't think there's an ethical problem at all. So in the Presidential Power blog, I was blogging daily and drawing a lot on the work of my colleagues here and had election forecast. I don't know when you had called it. It was like June of 2009 or something like that. And the people who, again, this is a self-selected audience, but the people who were writing in said, well, he's wrong if he was predicting the guy they didn't want to win was going to win, or yeah, I knew this all along. So our audience, and it may be changing, I don't think is big enough to have an impact on, and there's enough uncertainty in some of our forecasts, so Drew's quite right that 5 of those 13 were wrong, that I don't think we're really driving turnout, and the people who are really paying a lot of attention to us already have their minds made up. They're the activists. They're not going to change no matter what Drew tells them, or any of these people here.
Part of the snapshot metaphor is the ability to dodge that question or to try. And it may be, a genuine dodge. And as we move closer to saying this is a forecast, this is what we predict is going to happen, I think that's a fair point that these ethical issues get raised. There's not a whole lot of evidence by those who've tried to collect it that polls move preference or even turnout. I do think there's one time when, at least from my perspective, there is evidence that they matter, and I'm glad that they do, and that's in closely contested primaries. When I presented in Chicago, some of these folks saw it. I used the Washington, D.C. mayor's race as a sort of an example of where you had, it's classic, where you had 5 or 6 candidates. One candidate who was sort of polarizing, that people who was the incumbent, who people knew they were either for or against, and a bunch of other candidates kind of trying, sort of jockeying to be the lead competitor. And the fact that there was polling in the 10 days leading up to that race saying that one candidate was emerging from the pack, I have no doubt helped her, add another 5, 6, 7, 8 points to her total. And that's important. That's neighbors looking at each other and saying, in effect, what's the party deciding, to use the phrase the political scientists know, but how is the party coming together and who's doing better? That is an important thing, and I think we fill that mission.
I just want to give you 2 pieces of experimental evidence that might make you feel a little better about it. The first, and there's been a bunch of good experimental work coming out of Yale over the last 10 years about how to get people to vote in elections. And one of the more interesting findings is that when you deliver a randomly chosen set of people specific different messages, a different random set gets a different message. You guys know what I mean. We can tell them the election is coming up, don't forget to vote. We can tell them the election is going to be really close, your vote's really going to matter. Doesn't matter what you tell people, the effect seems to be the same. So you can cast a different kind of frame around the election and it doesn't change the effect of just telling people something. Okay, so that's one piece of evidence. Close election, do your duty, whatever, doesn't seem to affect people's calculation. The other piece of evidence that's interesting, though, is an experimental piece of evidence coming out of the Obama campaign in 2012, where they experimented with what to tell people in financial emails to raising money. And so when they found that when they told people, we're getting outspent, we're getting outraised, the other side is ahead, they actually got more money. Okay, which is the opposite of what you were suggesting, that a big lead actually causes the people behind to disengage and stay home. And it seems like there's some evidence that knowing the other side has a big lead actually causes people to dig in and engage more if they're behind.
One thing that's worth pointing out about the ethics of forecasting, those of you who have done forecasting and go to the public with it, it's not uncommon that you will be accused of being an advocate for the candidate or the party you're forecasting. I mean, I forecast elections all over the world, and I've been accused of being a communist, a socialist, a left-winger, a right-winger. You as a forecaster, as a scientific forecaster, you're rolling the dice and you're looking at the numbers. It's not your personal preference. But this is not an idle thing. I've been threatened. I mean, when actually threatened. I got called up on Christmas Day and was, they were going to drive by my house. So just be aware there is this political side to forecasting. Next question. Let's see. So, you sir, one more. Okay. This last question. Yeah.
I'd like to follow up on that previous question regarding the campaigns getting their message out. We talked a lot about states, but how micro are we getting on the data now that precinct performance is available and pretty regularly, and gross rating points? We mentioned TV before, it didn't matter or it did matter, but gross rating points are trackable in each state by purchases. It's publicly available. So, for example, 538 votes mattered, but they only mattered in the state of Florida. If they were in Iowa, it didn't change that election. So has anyone looked into controlling for the media markets themselves and what the buys might be to see if the buy does matter?
Okay, media markets and micro data question.
Yes. Well, media markets, campaign pollsters have been focused on them, for 30, 40 years. If you have, 800 or 1,000 interviews, you start to get some purchase on how markets differ. But I'm going to make a point that Drew made in a different way about I think the answer to your question is how micro is this getting? With enough data, it can get extraordinarily micro. And the the clinic that was put on this subject in 2012 was by the Obama campaign. I'm going to forget the number of calls they were doing a night, but it was, 10,000 a night nationally. I mean, they were doing 3 levels of surveys. They were doing a national poll, a subnational, it was sort of the battleground states. They were looking at each state separately, the traditional way, and then they were doing 10,000 calls, breaking all rules of how polling's supposed to be done, but modeling it in an exquisitely sophisticated way so that over the course of a week, if something changed, they gave this example, they could take apart which media market was it in Wisconsin? One of the smaller markets, they like to pick an example that they saw their polling move a little bit in one market. Now, normally that would be 100 interviews or 150 interviews, and you'd say, could be noise, could be crazy. A, they had enough that they felt it was real. B, they could then go look at every demographic in that group. I don't know if I doubt it went down to the precinct level, though they have different kinds of data at not the precinct level, but the individual level, because they've modeled the voter file. So hopefully a short answer to a great question.
So one last point is that, as you may tell, we love forecasting. We think it's fun, and it's also a really good for your brain. So I urge you to become a forecaster and read these models and challenge our work and see far. Thank you very much, and stay around and ask questions, and there's some beverages, so thank you for coming.